The cabin looked like it would blow down in a strong wind. That's what every homesteader in Minnesota Territory said when they saw it. The walls were thin, barely 6 inches thick, compared to the standard 12 to 18-inch log walls everyone else built. The logs themselves were smaller, lighter, creating a structure that seemed fragile and inadequate. The whole cabin looked insubstantial, flimsy, like a temporary shelter rather than a permanent home. It certainly didn't look like something that could survive a Minnesota winter. They said the thin walls would never keep the cold out. They said the light construction would leak heat like a sieve. They said the small logs would shrink and crack, opening gaps everywhere. They said the man who built it, a Swedish immigrant named Axel Lindström, clearly didn't understand how harsh Minnesota winters could be. They said he'd be begging for shelter at a neighbor's cabin before January ended. They said he'd probably freeze to death before spring. They said a lot of things, and none of it was kind. Then February of 1885 arrived, and an Arctic cold wave descended on Minnesota Territory with unprecedented fury. Temperatures plunged to 61 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. It was the coldest temperature ever recorded in the region, cold beyond anything the settlers had experienced, cold that killed livestock in their barns and froze water in buckets 3 feet from roaring fires. Cabins that had survived previous winters failed catastrophically. Families huddled in terror as ice formed on interior walls, and cabin temperatures dropped below freezing despite desperate fire feeding. Some didn't make it through the night, but in Axel's flimsy cabin, with its thin walls and light construction, the temperature stayed at 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 52 degrees. With 61 below outside, his cabin maintained a temperature differential of 113 degrees. His fragile-looking structure outperformed every thick, heavy cabin in Minnesota Territory. Suddenly, the flimsy cabin didn't look so flimsy anymore. The story begins in the spring of 1884, when Axel Lindström arrived in Minnesota Territory to claim his homestead. He was 39 years old, a former shipwright from Stockholm who'd spent 15 years building boats designed to survive the Baltic Sea in winter. He understood insulation, airflow, moisture management, and thermal efficiency better than any log cabin builder in Minnesota. He'd seen what happened when buildings were designed poorly for cold. He'd helped rescue sailors from ships that had iced over and become death traps. He knew cold, and he knew how to fight it. When Axel examined the typical Minnesota homestead cabin, he was troubled. The cabins were built using frontier logic. Bigger logs, thicker walls, more mass equals better protection. The walls were 12 to 18 inches thick, built from large logs, heavy and substantial looking. But Axel, with his shipbuilding background, saw the flaws immediately. The thick, solid logs conducted heat away. The gaps between logs, even when chinked, leaked air constantly. The single-wall construction had no thermal break, allowing interior heat to conduct directly through the wood to the exterior. These cabins looked strong and protective, but they were thermally inefficient. He tried to explain this to his nearest neighbor, a man named Robert Ferguson, who'd homesteaded in Minnesota for 6 years and considered himself experienced in frontier building. Ferguson took one look at Axel's plans and shook his head. "You're planning to build with 6-inch walls? That's crazy. You need thick walls for Minnesota winters, 12 inches minimum, 18 if you're smart. Thin walls won't keep you warm." Axel disagreed. Thick walls are not the same as insulated walls. Thick log wall still conducts heat through the wood. What you need is thermal break, airspace, multiple barriers. This is how we build in Sweden for cold water. The same principles work for cold air. Ferguson wasn't convinced. This isn't Sweden. This is Minnesota. We have real winters here. You build your thin-walled cabin if you want, but don't come crying to me when you're freezing. I'll say I told you so. Axel just smiled. We will see when winter comes. Construction began in May of 1884. Axel built his cabin using a method that seemed backwards to everyone watching. Instead of using the largest logs available, he selected smaller logs, only 4 to 5 inches in diameter. Instead of building a single thick wall, He built two separate walls with a space between them. The result was a cabin that looked impossibly light and fragile compared to the substantial log cabins around it. The construction method was precise. First, Axel built an inner wall using his small logs, carefully fitted and chinked. This inner wall was only 4 inches thick. Then, 6 inches outside this inner wall, he built a second wall, also using small logs, also 4 inches thick. This created 2 separate 4-inch log walls with a 6-inch gap between them. The total wall thickness was 14 inches. 4 inches of inner wall, 6 inches of gap, and 4 inches of outer wall. But unlike a solid 14-inch log, which would conduct heat through its entire mass, Axel's wall had a 6-inch thermal break in the middle. That 6-inch gap would be filled with insulation. For insulation, Axel used dried moss, sawdust, and wood shavings. He'd collected moss from the forest floor during the summer, drying it thoroughly in the sun. He'd gathered sawdust from a local sawmill. He'd saved wood shavings from his own log preparation. He mixed these materials together, creating a loose, fluffy insulation that trapped air. This mixture was packed carefully into the 6-inch gap between the walls, not packed too tightly, which would compress the air pockets and reduce insulation value, but firmly enough to prevent settling. The result was a wall assembly with excellent insulation properties. The inner wall kept the interior heat contained. The 6 inches of fluffy insulation trapped air and prevented heat conduction. The outer wall protected the insulation from weather. Each component had a specific purpose, and together they created a system far more thermally efficient than any solid log wall. When neighbors saw this construction, the comments began immediately. Robert Ferguson was among the first to visit. He examined the thin walls, the small logs, the space filled with what looked like trash, and couldn't hide his disapproval. "This is your cabin, 2 thin walls with moss and sawdust between them. This is what you're planning to live in?" Axel nodded. "Yes, this design will insulate much better than solid logs. The air trapped in the moss and sawdust, it cannot move, so it cannot carry heat away. The 2 walls create barrier on both sides. Heat stays inside." Ferguson tapped one of the small logs. "This is 4 inches. My cabin walls are 16 inches. Your walls are going to leak heat. You'll freeze. And look how flimsy this looks. These small logs, they're barely thicker than fence posts. This whole cabin looks like it'll fall apart." Axel explained patiently. "In shipbuilding, we learned that strong does not always mean heavy. A ship must be light enough to float but strong enough to survive storms. We use design, not just mass. This cabin is designed correctly. The walls are thin, but they are double. The insulation is light, but it traps air. This is better than one thick wall." Ferguson shook his head. "I've been through 6 Minnesota winters. I know what works. Thick walls work. Your thin walls are going to fail, and you're going to learn an expensive lesson." The mockery spread through the homesteading community. Everyone who saw Axel's cabin under construction had an opinion. One settler said it looked like a playhouse for children, not a real cabin. Another said the thin walls reminded him of a chicken coop. A woman at the trading post commented that it was a shame. That poor Swedish fellow building a cabin so flimsy he'd have to abandon it come winter. A group of settlers even made a wager. How long would Axel last in his flimsy cabin before he had to seek shelter elsewhere? Most bet he'd give up by January. A few optimists thought he might last until February. No one thought he'd make it through the entire winter in that inadequate structure. But Axel ignored the talk. He'd calculated the thermal resistance of his wall design. He understood that insulation value came from trapped air, not from mass. He knew his cabin would work. He just needed to finish it properly. The ceiling was built with the same double-layer approach. An inner ceiling, then insulation, then an outer roof. The floor was raised off the ground with a crawl space beneath, creating another insulation layer. Every aspect of the cabin was designed to minimize heat loss. By September, the cabin was complete. It looked strange, even Axel had to admit. The walls were noticeably thinner than neighboring cabins. The logs were smaller. The whole structure seemed less substantial, less protective. But it was precisely built, carefully insulated, and designed based on proven principles. The first cold weather arrived in November. Light frosts, nothing serious. Axel lit his stove modestly, just enough to keep comfortable. He monitored the interior temperature carefully. On a night when the outside temperature was 15 degrees above zero, his cabin interior stayed at 65 degrees. He was using very little firewood, far less than he'd expected. The insulation was performing even better than his calculations had predicted. December brought colder weather. Temperatures dropped to zero and below. Other homesteaders were burning wood constantly, keeping their fires high to maintain cabin warmth. Axel maintained his modest fire routine, a few hours of burning each morning and evening. His cabin stayed comfortable. The thin walls, packed with their fluffy insulation, were preventing heat loss effectively. His neighbors noticed that Axel's chimney rarely smoked. In winter, everyone's chimney should smoke constantly as fires burned day and night, but Axel's chimney was often quiet. This worried some neighbors. Was he out of wood? Was he too proud to ask for help? Robert Ferguson visited in late December, concerned. He knocked on Axel's door, expecting to find the cabin cold and Axel struggling. Instead, Axel opened the door wearing a light shirt, and warm air poured out. The cabin interior was comfortable, probably 60 degrees. "How are you doing this?" Ferguson asked. "Your fire is barely burning, but your cabin is warm. My cabin, I keep the fire going all day and all night, and I'm still cold." Axel invited him in. The insulation, the moss and sawdust between the walls, it traps air very effectively. Air is excellent insulator when it cannot move. My walls may be thin, but they insulate much better than your thick, solid logs. Ferguson examined the interior wall, touching the logs. They were slightly warm, not hot, not cold, just mildly warm. But shouldn't thin walls get cold faster? Axel shook his head. Thickness of material matters less than what the material is. Your 16-inch logs conduct heat through the whole thickness. My 4-inch logs only conduct through 4 inches, then there is 6 inches of insulation, then another 4 inches of logs. The heat must cross 3 barriers, and the middle barrier is very difficult to cross. Ferguson was beginning to understand, but he remained skeptical. "It's not even that cold yet. Wait until we get real cold. 20 below, 30 below. Then we'll see if your thin walls hold up." Axel nodded. "Yes, we will see." The real test came in February of 1885. A weather pattern unlike anything in recorded history developed over northern Canada. Arctic high-pressure system, massive and persistent, pushed frigid air south across the border into the United States. This wasn't a typical cold snap. This was Arctic air from the polar regions, displaced to latitudes where human settlements existed. The temperature began dropping on February 3rd. By February 4th, it was 20 below zero. By February 5th, 40 below. By February 6th, 50 below. And still it dropped. On February 7th, 1885, the temperature in Minnesota Territory reached 61 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. This was the coldest temperature ever recorded in the region up to that time. It was cold beyond comprehension, cold that seemed impossible in the continental United States. At 61 below, exposed skin froze in less than a minute. Breath turned to ice crystals instantly. Metal became brittle and shattered. Wood split from thermal stress, and staying alive became a desperate, uncertain struggle. Homesteaders across the territory fought for survival. They burned wood as fast as they could feed their stoves, burning furniture, floorboards, anything combustible. They layered on every piece of clothing they owned. They huddled together for warmth, and still the cold penetrated. Robert Ferguson later described the experience as terrifying. His cabin interior, despite a fire that consumed half a cord of wood per day, never got above 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on the interior walls. Water froze in cups near the fire. His family slept together in one bed, under every blanket and hide they owned, and still they shivered. They survived, but barely. Another homesteader, an older man named William Patterson, didn't survive. His stove ran out of wood during the night. He was too weak or too cold to get more. When neighbors found him 2 days later, he'd frozen to death in his bed. His cabin interior was below zero. The fire had gone out and the cold had killed him. At least 7 other deaths were attributed to the cold wave in the immediate region, and many more across the broader territory. Livestock died by the hundreds. Cabins suffered structural damage from the extreme cold. Families used up entire winter wood supplies in just a few days. It was a catastrophe. Axel's experience was remarkably different. When the temperature dropped to 61 below, he increased his fire slightly, burning it for longer periods. But he didn't panic. He didn't burn excessively. He trusted his insulation. On the worst night, February 7th, with 61 below outside, he monitored his cabin temperature continuously. The interior stayed at 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 52 degrees. Not warm by comfort standards, but far above freezing. Safe, survivable with basic bedding and clothing. His flimsy-looking cabin, with its thin walls and light construction, was maintaining a temperature differential of 113 degrees. He was 113 degrees warmer than the outside air, and he was burning approximately 1/4 the firewood his neighbors were using. The physics were working exactly as he'd designed them to work. The double walls created a thermal break. The insulation trapped air and prevented conduction. The careful chinking prevented air infiltration. Every aspect of the design contributed to heat retention. His cabin, which looked so fragile, was actually the most thermally efficient structure in Minnesota territory. When the cold wave finally broke on February 9th and temperatures climbed back to a merely brutal 25 below, homesteaders emerged to check on neighbors and assess damage. Several groups headed toward Axel's cabin, worried about the Swede and his thin-walled structure. They expected the worst. They'd seen his flimsy cabin. They knew how cold it had been. They assumed he must have either abandoned the cabin for shelter elsewhere or died trying to stay warm. What they found shocked them. Axel opened his door at their knock, looking rested and healthy. He was dressed normally, not bundled in excessive layers. His cabin interior was warm. His wood supply was largely intact. He'd survived the worst cold in Minnesota history with minimal difficulty, even comfort. Robert Ferguson stood in Axel's cabin, feeling the warmth, looking at the thin walls that had been the subject of so much mockery, and couldn't speak for a moment. Finally, he managed to ask, "How? Your walls are 6 inches thick. Mine are 16 inches. You should have frozen." "I nearly froze, and my walls are almost 3 times thicker." "How is your cabin warm?" Axel explained once more patiently. "It is not about thickness. It is about insulation. Your thick logs conduct heat through 16 inches of wood. My thin walls have insulation between them that does not conduct. The air, trapped in the moss and sawdust, cannot move, so it cannot carry heat away. My cabin holds heat. Your cabin loses heat. The thickness does not matter if the material conducts." Another settler in the group, a young man named Thomas Wright, asked what everyone was thinking. "Can you teach us this? Can we modify our cabins?" Axel's answer was immediate. "Of course. I will help anyone who wants to learn. This knowledge should not be secret." Over the following weeks, as winter continued, and the memory of 61 below remained vivid, homesteaders came to Axel for instruction. He explained the principles in detail. Double walls create a thermal break. Insulation must trap air without being too compressed. The materials can vary, but the principle remains the same. Air, when trapped and prevented from moving, is an excellent insulator. Mass without trapped air is not. He helped homesteaders design retrofits and improvements. Some built new inner walls inside their existing cabins, creating insulated cavities. Some added external walls, wrapping their cabins with an insulated layer. Some simply filled gaps and cracks with insulation material, reducing air infiltration. Every improvement, even partial implementations, showed benefits. By spring of 1885, 12 homesteaders had modified their cabins using Axel's principles. The results varied based on how completely they'd implemented the design, but all showed improvement. Cabins stayed warmer. Firewood consumption dropped. Families were more comfortable. Robert Ferguson built a complete double-wall structure as an addition to his cabin, essentially creating an insulated room. In the following winter, this room stayed 30 degrees warmer than his main cabin with the same fire. The difference was dramatic. If you're fascinated by how superior design and physics trumped brute force in the harshest conditions imaginable, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are so many more stories of ingenious frontier engineering waiting to be discovered. The science behind Axel's design is based on fundamental thermal physics. Heat loss from a building occurs through three primary mechanisms: conduction through solid materials, convection through air movement, and radiation through open space. Axel's double-wall design addressed all three. Conduction occurs when heat travels through solid materials. Different materials conduct at different rates. Wood is a moderate conductor. Stone is a good conductor. Metals are excellent conductors. Air is a poor conductor, which makes it an excellent insulator. Axel's solid log walls, the 4-inch inner and outer walls, did conduct some heat, but they only conducted through 4 inches of wood. Then the heat had to somehow cross the 6-inch insulated gap. This gap, filled with moss and sawdust that trapped air, was very difficult for heat to cross. The loose, fluffy material prevented conduction through solid contact. The trapped air prevented convection. The result was a massive reduction in heat transfer. Convection occurs when air moves, carrying heat with it. If air can circulate, it will carry heat from warm areas to cold areas very effectively. This is why drafty cabins are so hard to heat. Air infiltration brings cold air in and carries warm air out constantly. Axel's design prevented convection in two ways. First, the insulation between the walls trapped air and prevented circulation. Second, the careful chinking and sealing of both walls prevented outside air from infiltrating. No drafts meant no convective heat loss. Radiation occurs when warm objects emit infrared radiation to colder objects or spaces. This is how a fireplace warms you even when you're not touching it. Radiation can carry heat across empty space. Axel's multiple wall layers created radiation barriers. The inner wall radiated heat, but some of that radiation was absorbed by the insulation and outer wall. The outer wall radiated into the cold exterior, but it was receiving less heat to radiate than a single-layer wall would. The multiple barriers reduced total radiative heat loss. The mathematical analysis shows why Axel's design was so superior. R value measures thermal resistance. Higher R values mean better insulation. A solid 16-inch log wall has an R value of approximately R10 to R12, depending on wood type and condition. Axel's double wall with 6 inches of loose insulation had an R value of approximately R22 to R25. The insulation layer alone contributed about R15 to R18. His design was twice as insulating as the thick solid walls his neighbors used. In practical terms, this meant his cabin lost heat at half the rate. To maintain the same interior temperature, he needed half the heat input, meaning half the firewood. At 61 below outside and 52 inside, Axel's cabin was losing perhaps 3,000 BTUs per hour through the walls, ceiling, and floor combined. A cabin with conventional walls, to maintain 52 degrees inside, would be losing 6,000 to 7,000 BTUs per hour. This meant Axel's fire could be half the size. His wood consumption half as much, his labor cutting wood half as great. The structural analysis showed that the thin walls were adequate despite appearances. The small logs, while only 4 inches in diameter, were properly fitted and supported. The double wall construction actually created a stronger structure than a single wall because the two walls braced each other. The framework connecting the walls added rigidity. The result was a light but strong structure, efficient in material use and effective in performance. The weight comparison was striking. Axle's double wall assembly, including logs, insulation, and framework, weighed approximately 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. A solid 16-inch log wall of the same length weighed approximately 3,000 pounds. Axle's walls weighed 1/3 as much as conventional walls, while insulating twice as well. This reduced structural requirements, made construction easier, and reduced settling and foundation stress. The cost analysis favored Axle's design as well. The small logs were easier to harvest and transport than large logs. The insulation materials, moss and sawdust, were free. The additional labor of building 2 walls instead of 1 was offset by using smaller, lighter logs. Total construction cost was comparable or even slightly less than conventional construction, but the ongoing fuel savings were substantial. Over a 10-year life, the firewood savings would far exceed any additional construction cost. The moisture management was another advantage that became apparent over time. Solid log walls, when exposed to rain and temperature fluctuations, absorbed moisture and released it slowly. This moisture could lead to rot and reduce insulation value. Axle's double wall design had an outer wall that protected the insulation from weather and an inner wall that was shielded from exterior moisture. The insulation stayed dry, maintaining its effectiveness. The cabin required less maintenance and lasted longer. The ventilation design, while subtle, was important. Axle had built small, controlled vents that allowed interior humidity to escape without creating drafts. This prevented moisture buildup inside the cabin, which would reduce insulation effectiveness and create discomfort. The vents were positioned high, where warm, moist air naturally accumulated, and were small enough not to significantly affect heat retention. By the late 1880s, double-wall insulated construction had become relatively common in Minnesota Territory. Perhaps 40 to 60 homesteaders had adopted some version of the technique. Variations existed. Some used sawdust exclusively for insulation. Some used dried grasses. Some used wood shavings. Some built thinner or thicker cavities depending on material availability and specific needs. But all followed Axle's core principle: create a thermal break with trapped air insulation between structural walls. The technique spread to neighboring territories. Homesteaders in Wisconsin, North Dakota, and Manitoba heard about the Swedish double-wall cabin that survived 61 below. Some tried the method. The knowledge was spreading through the informal networks of the frontier. A particularly successful implementation occurred in a small church built in 1887. The congregation, mostly homesteaders who'd experienced the February 1885 cold wave, wanted a building that could be heated efficiently for Sunday services. They used Axle's double-wall design with 8 inches of sawdust insulation. The church could be warmed quickly with a small stove and stayed comfortable throughout services. The fuel savings over conventional construction paid for the extra building cost within 2 years. Another application was in a small schoolhouse. The school board, responsible for heating costs, was attracted to the fuel efficiency of double-wall construction. The schoolhouse, built in 1888 using Axle's principles, used approximately 1/3 the firewood of a comparable conventional building. Children and teachers were more comfortable, and the board saved money. Some commercial buildings adopted the technique as well. A general store in a small town built double walls with insulation and advertised the year-round comfort as a feature. Customers appreciated shopping in a space that stayed warm in winter without being overheated near the stove, and stayed cool in summer by keeping heat out. But the technique also saw failures when improperly implemented. Some builders didn't seal the wall cavities properly, allowing air to circulate through the insulation. This reduced effectiveness dramatically because convection carried heat away. Axel emphasized when teaching others that the insulation cavity must be sealed to prevent air movement. Some builders used insulation materials that settled or compacted over time, creating gaps at the top of the wall cavity. These gaps allowed heat to escape. Axel recommended using insulation that resisted settling or designing the cavity to allow for top-up of insulation material after initial settling. Another failure mode was using materials that absorbed moisture. Some builders used materials like hay or straw that would rot when damp. The insulation degraded, lost effectiveness, and created problems. Axel recommended dry materials that resisted moisture and designing walls to keep insulation dry. Despite these occasional failures, the success rate was high. Builders who understood the principles and executed carefully achieved excellent results. Double-wall insulated construction became recognized as superior for cold climates. Axel himself continued homesteading until 1902, when at age 57 he sold his claim and moved to Minneapolis. He worked as a building consultant, advising on insulation and thermal efficiency. His expertise, proven by his survival of 61 below in a supposedly flimsy cabin, was valued. He could command good fees for his knowledge. He died in 1924 at age 79, having lived long enough to see insulated construction become standard practice in cold climate building. His original cabin stood until 1936, when new owners demolished it to build a larger house. The double-wall structure, 52 years old, was still sound and functional. Parts of the cabin were salvaged, and some of the logs are now in a museum in St. Paul, Minnesota, labeled as examples of innovative frontier insulation techniques. The February 1885 cold wave became a defining event in Minnesota Territory history. It killed dozens of people and thousands of livestock. It tested every aspect of frontier construction and found much of it wanting, but it also validated the importance of understanding thermal physics and proper insulation design. Axel's flimsy cabin, mocked before the cold wave, became legendary afterward. The story was told throughout the region. The Swedish shipwright who built a cabin that looked weak but performed better than anything else. The thin walls that outperformed thick walls. The light construction that saved lives while heavy construction failed. Modern building science has completely validated Axel's approach. Contemporary building codes in cold climates require insulated wall cavities, vapor barriers, and thermal breaks. This is standard practice now, required by law. But in 1884, Axel was pioneering these concepts, applying shipbuilding knowledge to cabin construction. Before we conclude this remarkable story of survival through superior design, if you've been captivated by how understanding physics can mean the difference between life and death, and you want to hear more forgotten innovations that solved impossible problems, hit that subscribe button. The most incredible stories of frontier ingenuity are still ahead. The comparison to modern construction is instructive. A contemporary insulated wall in a cold climate might achieve R20 to R30 insulation value using fiberglass, foam, or other modern materials between studs. Axel achieved R22 to R25 using moss and sawdust in 1884. His performance matched modern standards using frontier materials. Some modern natural builders have recreated wall systems similar to Axel's, using double studs with cellulose or other natural insulation. These double stud walls perform excellently in cold climates. The builders often don't know they're following a design pioneered by a Swedish shipwright in Minnesota Territory. They've rediscovered the same principles. The legacy of Axel's work extends beyond the specific design. It represents a crucial principle. Appearance doesn't determine performance. The thick, heavy cabins looked strong and protective. Axel's thin, light cabin looked weak and inadequate. But performance depends on physics, not appearance. The thick walls conducted heat poorly. The thin walls with insulation insulated well. Reality trumped perception. This lesson applies broadly. In any engineering challenge, what matters is how the system actually performs, not how it looks or how conventional wisdom suggests it should work. Understanding the fundamental principles allows you to design solutions that work, even if they look wrong to people who don't understand those principles. The social dynamics illustrated in the story are also important. Axel was an outsider, an immigrant with different knowledge and experience. His approach contradicted local conventional wisdom. He was mocked and doubted because his design looked wrong and because it came from elsewhere. But when the ultimate test arrived, the 61 below cold wave, knowledge defeated convention. Axel's design succeeded. Conventional designs struggled or failed. Evidence and results forced reconsideration. The mockers became students. The doubters became converts. This pattern appears throughout history. New approaches that contradict tradition are initially rejected. Then harsh reality validates the new approach, and adoption follows. Axel's generosity in sharing his knowledge was crucial to its spread. He could have kept his techniques secret, maintaining competitive advantage. Instead, he taught freely, helping neighbors improve their homes. This collaborative approach benefited the entire community. When more people had better insulated cabins, the whole settlement was safer, stronger, more resilient. Axel understood this and acted accordingly. The economic value of Axel's innovation was substantial. Every homesteader who adopted double wall construction saved approximately 50% on heating costs. Over the typical 15 to 20-year life of a frontier cabin, that might be 10 to 15 cords of wood saved per year, or 150 to 300 cords total. At historical prices, that was substantial value. The labor savings from reduced wood cutting added additional value. The lives saved are harder to quantify but arguably most important. How many people who might have died in future cold events survived because they had better insulated cabins? We'll never know precisely, but undoubtedly some. Better insulation was life-saving technology on the frontier. The practical lessons remain relevant today. If you're building in a cold climate, understanding thermal physics is essential. Wall thickness matters less than insulation value. Trapped air is an excellent insulator. Multiple barriers reduce heat transfer. These principles, which Axel demonstrated in 1884, remain true and applicable. For anyone interested in sustainable building and energy efficiency, Axel's story provides inspiration. He achieved excellent thermal performance using simple, natural materials and basic construction techniques. Modern materials can achieve even better performance, but the core approach, multiple walls with trapped air insulation, remains optimal. The comparison between Axel's cabin and conventional cabins during the 61 below cold wave tells everything. Axel's cabin, 52 degrees inside with modest fire, 1/4 normal wood consumption, complete safety and comfort. Robert Ferguson's cabin, 22 degrees inside with massive fire, quadruple normal wood consumption, barely survived. William Patterson's cabin, froze below zero, occupant died. The difference was design. The difference was understanding. The difference was life and death. The flimsy cabin that everyone mocked wasn't flimsy in its thermal performance. It was flimsy in appearance only. The thin walls were actually superior to thick walls because they trapped insulation. The light construction was actually stronger pound for pound than heavy construction. The appearance was deceptive. The physics were sound. The results were undeniable. Everyone said it would fail. Everyone said Axel would freeze. Everyone said thin walls couldn't work. They were wrong about everything. The flimsy cabin survived the 61 below cold wave. It kept Axel safe while others died. It proved that knowledge beats tradition, that design beats mass, that understanding beats assumption. The mockery stopped after the cold wave. The learning began. Homesteaders sought Axel's advice. The thin-walled cabin became the model for efficient construction. The Swedish shipwright who'd been pitied became the expert everyone consulted. That's how innovation spreads, through dramatic demonstration, through survival when others perish, through results so obvious that even skeptics must acknowledge them. Axel had those results. His cabin was warm, his woodpile was full. He was alive and healthy while neighbors had died. The evidence was overwhelming. The flimsy cabin worked, everything else was opinion. The story of Axel Lindström and his double-wall insulated cabin is ultimately about the power of applied knowledge, the courage to build differently despite mockery, and the vindication that comes from being right when everyone says you're wrong. It's about a Swedish shipwright who understood thermal physics, who designed a solution that looked wrong but worked perfectly, who saved his own life and taught others to save theirs. The cabin looked flimsy, the walls were thin, the construction seemed inadequate, but it survived 61 below zero Fahrenheit. It maintained 52 degrees inside while neighbors' cabins froze. It used 1/4 the firewood and provided twice the comfort. The flimsy cabin wasn't flimsy. It was the best designed structure in Minnesota territory. Axel Lindström knew this from the start. His neighbors learned it when the cold wave arrived. The lesson is timeless. Understand the principles, trust the physics, build for performance, not appearance. And when everyone says your approach is wrong, but you know it's right, have the courage to proceed. The results will vindicate you. The flimsy cabin did exactly that. It survived the cold wave, and in surviving, it proved everything.